Good day. Biden and Putin have had their virtual summit, and as is now traditional for this channel, I'm going to read out the readouts that the two governments have published. I will start with the much shorter American readout, and it reads as follows. President Joseph R. Biden held a secure video call today with President Vladimir Putin of Russia to discuss a range of issues on the US-Russia agenda. President Biden voiced the deep concerns of the United States and our European allies about Russia's escalation of forces surrounding Ukraine and made clear that the US and our allies would respond with strong economic and other measures in the event of military escalation. President Biden reiterated his support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and called for de-escalation and a return to diplomacy. The two presidents tasked their teams to follow up, and the US will do so in coordination with allies and partners. The presidents also discussed the US-Russia dialogue on strategic stability, a separate dialogue on ransomware, as well as joint work on regional issues such as Iran. Now, note the important words: the two presidents tasked their teams to follow up, and the US will do so in close coordination with allies and partners. Follow up about what precisely? Well, we come now to the Russian readout, and that provides us some insight to this. And as always now, when discussing readouts by governments, the Chinese and Russian readouts are far more informative about what happened over the course of a discussion than the American one is. And the Russian readout reads as follows. Vladimir Putin had a lengthy conversation with President of the United States of America, Joseph Biden. In particular, the two presidents discussed the outcomes of the June 2020 Russian-American summit in Geneva, noting the importance of consistent progress in implementing the agreements reached at the highest level and preserving the Geneva spirit when discussing bilateral relations or other issues that may arise between Russia and the United States. Before I press on, I would say that that suggests a rather conciliatory start to the conversation, and that is consistent with the friendly greetings that the two leaders exchanged with each other, of which we have been provided by the Russians, incidentally, with a brief video clip. Anyway, to continue. In the context, the presidents recalled the fact that the two countries were allies during World War II. They emphasized the need to remember the sacrifices made at that time, whilst this allied relationship must set an example for establishing contacts and working together in today's reality. December the 7th, which is the day when this summit meeting took place, is of course the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack on the United States, which took place on December 7th, 1941. And it's obvious that Putin seized that as an opportunity to remind Biden of the fact that these two countries, now such bitter adversaries, were once allies. Then we come to the essential issues under discussion, and this is what the Russian readout says. The intra-Ukrainian crisis and the lack of progress in implementing the 2015 Minsk agreements, which have no alternative for bringing about a peaceful resolution, top the conversation's agenda. The president of Russia shared specific examples to illustrate the destructive nature of Kiev's policy to dismantle the Minsk package of measures and the agreements reached within the Normandy format. He also expressed serious concern about Kiev's provocative actions against Donbass. Joseph Biden, in turn, focused on what he described as threatening, and the Russian readout puts the words threatening in quotation marks, movements of Russian troops near the Ukrainian border, and outlined the sanctions the United States and its allies would be ready to impose should the situation escalate any further. In response, Vladimir Putin warned against shifting the responsibility on Russia, since it was NATO that was undertaking dangerous attempts to gain a foothold on Ukrainian territory and building up its military capabilities along the Russian border. It is for this reason that Russia is eager to obtain reliable, legally binding guarantees ruling out the eventuality of NATO's eastward expansion and the deployment of offensive weapon systems in the countries neighbouring Russia. The two leaders agreed to instruct their representatives to engage in meaningful consultations on these sensitive matters. Now, the American readout confirms that there was an agreement that the two teams should meet and hold discussions. The Russian readout implies that the agreement is about the topic that the Russians have brought up, the eastward expansion of NATO, and that far from rejecting this, the Russian points out of hand, the United States has in effect agreed that there will in fact be discussions on these very topics, and we will come to that, and we will see what the Russians have had further comments to make about this. But we will talk about exactly what the Russians are saying was discussed. But anyway, the Russian readout implies that the discussions are going to be about Russia's concerns about the eastward expansion of NATO. To return, the meeting also included an exchange of views on information security with both sides, emphasising the importance of the ongoing dialogue on this topic. They expressed their readiness to continue working together on practical matters relating to combating cybercrime through the criminal justice process, as well as using technical intelligence. They discussed the developments around the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the Iranian nuclear program. The Russian president noted the importance of ensuring that it is fully implemented in its original version. The leaders expressed hope that the talks on this issue, which resumed in late November in Vienna, will be constructed and will bring about solutions that will be acceptable to all the parties involved. The two presidents discussed the bilateral agenda, stating that the level of cooperation between their countries remained unsatisfactory. In particular, the situation manifests itself in the challenges faced by the scaled-down diplomatic missions of the two countries. Vladimir Putin stressed that all this results from the policy line adopted by the US authorities as far back as 5 years ago, when they started enacting far-reaching restrictions, bans and mass expulsions of Russian diplomats, compelling Russia to respond in kind. Russia proposed resetting all the existing restrictions regarding the functions of the diplomatic missions, which could help bring other aspects of diplomatic relations between the two countries back to normal. The presidents expressed the view that, considering the special responsibility for international security and stability, Russia and the United States will continue their dialogue and the necessary contacts. Overall, the conversation took place in a sincere and business-like atmosphere. So that is the Russian readout, and as I said, it's more informative, but we are beginning to see that there are moves towards a discussion that will look at least the Russians say, a discussion that will look at the general state of the situation in Europe. Now, we have to consider perhaps how we've got to this situation, and then before we do that, after we've done that, maybe we can discuss the overall situation and how it's arisen. I think the first thing to say is that we are, and this may surprise people to hear, at the beginning of the end of the Ukrainian crisis. I stress the beginning of the end. There is still a huge amount of work to go on, and very strong probabilities or possibilities that the situation might escalate unexpectedly. But the Russians have now made absolutely clear that Ukrainian membership of NATO is for them a red line, and that they will not accept and that they will not tolerate it. The United States, in turn, has accepted that it will take no military action to protect Ukraine. That means that since the Russians have said that Ukrainian membership of NATO is a red line, and the United States will not take any military counteraction to resist the Russian red line, that red line has implicitly been accepted in Washington. It also means that in effect means that Ukraine will never join NATO. Now, I realize that this is not perhaps quite what people appreciate or take away from this summit meeting, from the diplomatic moves that have happened. But from the moment that the Russians have said that Ukrainian membership of NATO is a red line, and the US has responded by saying that it will not fight to defend Ukraine in the event that there is a Russian offensive in Ukraine, in effect, Ukraine's prospect of entering NATO has become dead. It is no longer going to happen. The following point from this is that since the United States has now implicitly acknowledged that Ukrainian membership of NATO will never happen, the logic of agreeing to some sort of agreement with Russia, some sort of legally binding agreement, ending eastward expansion of NATO, that is now beginning to become much more realistic and far more probable. Since there is no prospect of Ukraine ever joining NATO, why not acknowledge that fact and accept it and confirm it in a treaty? Now, I appreciate this isn't something, again, as I said, that people are necessarily taking away from the summit. But if we go not so much to the statements that US officials are making at the moment, but rather to what parts of the American media, to the Western media are saying, and perhaps here one should say more the British than the American media, we can see that that is exactly the direction of travel now. Let's begin with the Financial Times. The Financial Times published an article, an editorial in fact, on the eve of the summit meeting, which had all the usual tropes about Russian aggression and about the nature of the confrontation in Ukraine, and about the fact that the United States, that the Western powers will never agree to a Russian veto over Ukrainian membership. But then we go on to read in the editorial, and this is a Financial Times editorial, the following: Biden should at the same time send a message to Putin that the United States and Western partners are prepared to engage in talks with Moscow on reforming a European security architecture that looks increasingly precarious, subject to conditions. One must be that all Russian troops and hardware first return to their permanent bases. And then the editorial goes on to say The president must also make clear that there can be no return to zones of influence in Europe imposed by force. The Putin circle have repeatedly hinted they're seeking a new Yalta, referring to the 1945 meeting where Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt carved up post-war Europe. By the way, that is a complete misrepresentation. I've never seen any Russian official refer to the Yalta Conference in any of the recent discussions that have taken place, nor have I seen any hints about that. But then the editorial goes on to say, Ukraine's future cannot be negotiated as Moscow wants over the head of Kiev or its choice of allies blocked by threats or diktat. Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea and Donbass must be part of any negotiation. So already we're talking about a negotiation about a new security architecture. And all these attempts to pile in conditions, but we'll see what these mean in practice. But then the editorial finishes by saying even sitting down for such talks would risk appearing to reward Moscow for aggression. Making them a success would require bold and creative diplomacy. The US approach should combine toughness with incentives that in fact call the Russian leader's bluff and challenge him to break out of the perilous downward spiral in relations that he is creating. Now, of course, this reverses the true situation because, as Putin has pointed out, it is the eastward expansion of NATO and regime change operations in places like Kiev, which have been the cause of tension in Europe. But the Financial Times, which in terms of British media is neocon central, and which, by the way, has become the favoured outlet of neocon thinking in the United States. It's in the Financial Times that one reads all the stories about Chinese hypersonic glide missile tests, Russian build-ups around Ukrainian borders, all of those things. Now grudgingly accepts that negotiations on the overall European security architecture and an admission that this has become increasingly precarious, it accepts that those negotiations are coming. It tries to hedge those with conditions, but we will see that those conditions may not be quite as effective as the United States, as the Financial Times and the neocons think. And then we go to the London Times, and the London Times says the following, and this is another editorial, and I would add that London Times also is very plugged in to neocon thinking and to official thinking, both in London and Washington, and is also used sometimes as a sounding board to set out neocon views. But it says the following: Mr. Biden's threat of sanctions, will Mr. Biden's threat of sanctions be sufficient to deter Mr. Putin? The threat followed a call with the leaders of Britain, France, Germany and Italy on Monday, in which a package of measures were discussed, including cutting off Russia's access to the global financial system. That would impose a heavy economic cost, though Russia has been subject to punitive sanctions for years, and some of those costs would inevitably fall on Western economies. Meanwhile, the fact that Western leaders are making economic threats is implicit acknowledgement that there is no appetite for military support for Kiev beyond offers of equipment and training. So, again, you see an acknowledgement in the London Times that these financial sanctions that are being talked about may in fact have only a limited effect on Russia, but will now start to cause hurt to Western economies and that the Western powers have ruled out direct military support for Kiev in a military confrontation between Ukraine and Russia. So already that is starting to admit, it's edging towards an admission that the balance of power is in fact quietly shifting in Russia's favour. And then we go back to the Financial Times and we read this comment from Gideon Rachman, who is one of the most outspoken anti-Russian voices on the Financial Times, somebody who again is very close to, very attuned to neocon thinking in the United States and in Britain, and also to official thinking there. And he writes the following: to avert a conflict, the Russians are demanding an explicit guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO. That demand is likely to be central to the conversation between Putin and Joe Biden. And we've seen from the Russian readout that that was indeed the case. And then Gideon Rachman goes on to say, Moscow's demand sounds like something Washington might consider. The reality is that Ukraine is a long way from joining NATO anyway. Making that really explicit may not seem like such a momentous concession, particularly if it can avert a conflict. And then, of course, inevitably, he adds reservations. He says that the US and NATO will be very reluctant to make that deal. The first is a matter of principle. Ukraine is a sovereign country, etc. The second is prudential. Would giving Russia what it really wants really end the possibility of a war? Well, the answer is it probably would, at least in the short term, and for all sorts of reasons that we will see. But I come back to this. We see even hardline neocon outlets in Britain starting to grudgingly admit that negotiations have to start about reforming the European security architecture. They're not yet willing to accept that that will include a pledge not to extend NATO eastward, but that has to be the implication. And they are even admitting that the reality is that since the West is not going to defend Ukraine, and Ukraine is not going to join NATO anytime soon, that is a concession which is not unreasonable. And of course, the London Times has gone further still, and it has admitted that the sanctions that Biden is threatening may not have much effect on Russia, but could cause real injury to Western economies. And on that issue, we've actually had some information from the Russians themselves. And this is what Yuri Ushakov, who is Putin's key foreign policy aide, this is what he said to, Putin said to Biden. Putin said to Biden over the course of the summit meeting. And Putin said, apparently, according to Ishakov, on the topic of sanctions, the following: the US president spoke about possible sanctions, and our president spoke about what the Russian side needs, and that sanctions are not a new thing. They have been in place for rather a long time, but unfortunately there is no positive effect from them, either for the US or for Russia. And it's unclear why these sanctions should be slapped. Our president told Biden that you worry about something that we don't understand, and we worry about what is clear for us. Let's see how this conversation will translate into particular actions and particular steps. And then Ushakov also, very importantly, went on to say, over the course of his various conversations with Russian journalists that the Russians, that Biden, in a sense, in effect, agreed that there would indeed be discussions about eastward expansion of NATO, which is what the Russians say they want. So Ushakov has in effect said that the United States has in effect admitted that there will indeed be negotiations on the subject of the eastward expansion of NATO. And we have had some words from Ushakov about this. And this is again Ushakov. Ultimately, the leaders agreed to task their teams, their representatives, with getting in touch on these sensitive issues, with getting in touch promptly. Putin said it straightforwardly that we are worried by Ukraine's intensified military activities and the presence of NATO in the immediate vicinity from Russia's borders. He spoke about recent military exercise in the Black Sea carried out by a national group of NATO forces. In this regard, he of course outlined our ideas about the need for certain guarantees, including guarantees of judicial nature that will ensure our security and create conditions for our normal development. And in return, apparently, according to Ushakov, the United States did agree to hold discussions on these topics. And we will see what actually comes of that. But that apparently is the nature of the discussions that are going to take place. So we shall see how this will happen. But Ushakov apparently says that these discussions could take years, but that they will be in time unfold. That there will be these discussions, and we will see how these will unfold. Anyway, that's where we are. The question now of some kind of agreement to reform European security architecture, some kind of agreement to formally accept the end to the eastward expansion of NATO is now on the table. And the topic of Ukraine joining NATO is in effect off the table. The United States has implicitly recognized Russia's red lines. It will not fight in order to enable Ukraine to become part of NATO. It will not fight to defend Ukraine. And the Russians have extracted, as a result of all this complex game of poker that we've seen being played over the last few weeks, those essential concessions from the United States. They're still not fully crystallized. They're certainly not crystallized in treaty form, but we can see how the agenda has been shifted. It's been shifted in a way that essentially means that the United States is implicitly accepting Russian red lines and is implicitly accepting it will not fight for Ukraine, and it is implicitly accepting that since it will not fight Russia in Ukraine, and since the Russians have made Ukrainian membership of NATO a red line, that there will be no Ukrainian membership for NATO. So it's quite a complicated situation. We are, as Ushakov says, right at the start of a complex process, but we can start to see the direction to which we are now edging. Now, just a few further points to make here. The first is, obviously, this situation has arisen in a very odd way. At the moment, it's looking unlikely that the Ukrainian military is really planning an offensive in eastern Ukraine. It's used Turkish-supplied drones to attack the militia without a great deal of effect, apparently. It launched some javelin missiles at militia targets, which apparently failed to hit their targets. And we've seen a situation where there's been threatening words from Ukraine, but no actual major redeployment of troops and forces in eastern Ukraine. And the reporting on the spot from the London Times and other places suggests a demoralized Ukrainian army bogged down in trench warfare, unable to advance. In addition, there is no Russian deployments directly on Ukraine's borders. No sign of the Russians preparing some imminent attack on Ukraine. The Russians have repeatedly said they have no such plan. The Russians have repeatedly said that they will launch such attacks if there is a Ukrainian offensive in Donbass, or if Russia's red lines are crossed with respect to NATO membership and forward deployment of US weapon systems in Ukraine. But that is not the scenario at the moment. And as we see, in effect, anyway, the United States has now ruled out both of those possibilities. So why are we in this situation? What has arisen? Why have we had all this talk about a war this winter when it doesn't seem as if exactly the situation actually points to a war? I'm going to guess that it arises from various diplomatic exchanges that have taken place between the Russians and the Americans since the Geneva summit. It seems to me that what happened over the course of those exchanges is that one particular US official, Victoria Nuland, eventually went to Moscow. She had a very difficult meetings with Russian officials and apparently left extremely angry. She was probably made angrier still when the White House decided to send William Burns, the CIA director, on a secret trip to Moscow in order to try to repair some of the damage she'd done. And my impression is that she spread stories, and her friends in the State Department and in the intelligence community and in the neocon publications have spread stories across the media of a Russian invasion and an imminent Russian attack on Ukraine, partly as a reflection of her anger, but partly because she is becoming, and people of her sort are becoming, increasingly concerned that the prospect of Ukrainian membership of NATO, which they've staked so much on, is now gradually disappearing into the mist. And I suspect that she was hoping to create some kind of atmosphere of crisis in order to kick jump a situation where sanctions, which I suspect have been on the table for a very long time. They've been lying around in preparation in the event of a war in eastern Ukraine, where those sanctions could be broached openly in a way that would destabilize the Russians and kick jump this sort of conflict. Well, the Russians have shrugged off the threat of sanctions. I would add the ruble has been completely stable, despite all the warnings and threats about sanctions. The only effect the talk of the sanctions has had is it led to a sharp rise in gas prices in Europe, which presumably the Europeans don't want. And we understand that at least one European government, probably the French, has been extremely unhappy about the whole affair and has pushed back strongly and has said that he doesn't see any evidence of this major Russian troop build-up that people have been talking about. The Russians have been building up their forces in their base areas. They've been sorting out the logistics and the preparations in case there is a war in eastern Ukraine, but there is no evidence at the moment that they're preparing for any kind of attack. And of course, the Europeans do not want to get into a further, deeper sanctions war with Russia, in which, as I have said, they would be the ones who would probably end up paying the heaviest price. So that, in effect, means that they now have an added incentive to try to prevent a war breaking out in Ukraine, and they will be making that increasingly clear, one suspects, both to the Americans and to the Ukrainians also. And I understand that President Macron of France, the greatest skeptic amongst all the European leaders, apparently is now intending to talk to both Zelensky and Putin to see how this thing can move forward following the events that we've just seen and the summit meeting between Biden and Putin, which has just taken place. Bear in mind that Macron has been a critic of NATO. He even described the alliance at one point as essentially brain dead. Anyway, so there we are. We can see how a manufactured crisis has ended up leading to talks, ever so sensitive talks at a very early stage, talks which could easily be derailed, could easily go wrong, about reforming Europe's security architecture. Talks where the Russians have now made it very clear that they will insist upon an explicit pledge that the eastward expansion of NATO has come to a stop, and where even neocon or voices in the media like the Financial Times and the London Times are ever so grudgingly coming to accept that that is a realistic outcome. Ukraine cannot join NATO. The Russians have, in effect, now imposed a veto on that ever happening. They've said that such a step would breach their red lines and they would use military force to prevent it. The Western powers are not prepared to fight for Ukraine. So given that that is so, they're not prepared to take the Russians on in the event that Ukraine were to join NATO and the Russians were to react in the way that I have said. The Europeans do not want an escalation of the sanctions war, which would hurt their own economies. So the logic of agreeing to that reform of the security architecture, in effect, to an end to NATO's eastward expansion, is now starting to become compelling. It's not been officially, formally accepted. There would be enormous resistance, both in Washington and Brussels and London and other places, to it being accepted. But the item on the agenda is there. If the neocons, if Victoria Nuland and people like her thought that by talking up this crisis this winter, they would put the Russians on the defensive and that they would precipitate some kind of crisis, well, it seems to me that all that they've managed to do is that they've been outplayed in a game of high stakes poker with the Russians. The Russians have managed both to get implicit acceptance of their red lines, and they've also managed to get the reform of Europe's security architecture on the diplomatic agenda. As I said, it doesn't mean that the conflict between the United States and Russia, between Russia and the West, is over. On the contrary, we can expect many bumps on the road, and things can go very badly wrong at any time. But for the first time, we're starting to see a way ahead, a way out of this crisis in Europe that has existed and has been festering ever since the Western powers broke the promises they made to Mikhail Gorbachev at the end of the Cold War and started to expand NATO East. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel. And please also remember to join us on Locals as well, where we're doing an increasing number of programs and where I'm doing programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, and where I also do live streams. And please also, you can look us up on our various other platforms: BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, and SuperU. And also you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and going to our shop and buying the wonderful things that we have there. Our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, our magic mugs, and all the rest. And at the same time, and in addition, please remember to tick the like button to this video if you've liked this video, and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day. Until then.